My father texted me at 6:47 a.m. on September 14th. My wedding was at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The text was 9 words. We're still in Dubai. So sorry. Have a beautiful day. I read it 3 times. I set my phone face down on the bathroom counter. Then I picked up my mascara and kept going. I am an estate planning paralegal. I have spent 11 years inside the most precise, unambiguous documents that human beings produce. I have watched families fall apart over language like residue of the estate and per stirpes distribution. I know what it looks like when someone puts their priorities in writing and then refuses to admit what they've done. I see it in probate court. I saw it in that text message. This is a story about what my parents thought my wedding was worth, and what I learned, quietly, professionally, without a single raised voice, about what they had already put in writing years before I ever got engaged. Welcome to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and what gets left behind when people show you who they are, those stories are your reason to be here. Drop a comment and hit subscribe. I'll be here when you need it most. I grew up in a house where my brother Marcus was the event and the rest of us were the venue. That is not bitterness. That is the most precise description I can give you. My parents did not think of themselves as playing favorites. They thought of themselves as responding to need, and Marcus, for years older than me, loud where I was quiet, demanding where I was self-sufficient, always needed more. More money. More intervention. More explanation to teachers, to coaches, to employers who couldn't understand why he wasn't living up to his potential. I learned early that self-sufficiency was not a virtue in our family. It was a permission slip for neglect. The child who didn't ask for anything got nothing, and everyone called it easy. I paid my own college tuition through a combination of scholarships and weekend paralegal work starting at 19. My parents wrote Marcus a check for his first 2 years at a school he left without graduating. I don't say this to catalog injuries. I say it because in estate planning, we call it pattern of distribution. It matters. I met David at a conference in 2019. He was a corporate attorney. We were both presenting, on opposite sides of a panel about digital assets in probate, and he argued against 3 of my points so precisely and with such genuine interest in being right that I respected him immediately. We were engaged within 14 months. His parents, Margaret and Gerald, met me 4 weeks after we started dating. Margaret brought a handwritten recipe card to that first dinner. Gerald shook my hand and said, "David talks about you like you're something worth talking about." They were the kind of people who showed up. You learn to notice that. My parents met David in the spring. My mother said he seemed very polished. My father asked if the firm he worked for was the kind that handled regular people's problems. I noted both things. I did not file them yet. The wedding date was set for September 14th. We booked the venue 16 months out. My mother came to exactly 1 planning meeting and spent most of it discussing her outfit. My father asked twice whether we could move the date because September was iffy for travel. I told him no. The deposit was non-refundable and the date was final. Marcus announced his Dubai trip in July. A group of his friends, 6 men, all of whom had graduated from the arrested adolescence of their mid-20s at slightly different speeds, had planned a 10-day trip to coincide with what Marcus described as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. He called it a work trip. The Instagram grid he kept during it did not look like work. The trip ran September 10th through the 20th. My wedding was September 14th. I found out on a Tuesday evening when my mother called to tell me that she and my father had talked about it a lot, and that they were going to Dubai with Marcus because the flights were already purchased, and the hotel was non-refundable, and she was sure I would understand because I was always so understanding. I sat at my kitchen table. I had a legal pad in front of me from a client meeting that afternoon. I turned it over to the blank side. I wrote down the date, the time, and what she said, as close to verbatim as I could manage. I underlined, "Always so understanding." I asked one question. "Are you telling me you're missing my wedding?" She said, "Honey, we'll celebrate when we get back. We'll do a dinner." I said, "Okay." And I ended the call. David was in the other room. I did not go tell him immediately. I sat with the legal pad for a while, and I did the thing I do when something doesn't add up. I went back to the beginning. The flights were purchased in April. I know this because I found the booking confirmation in a family email thread 3 months earlier, when my mother had accidentally copied me on a message about travel logistics. I had scrolled past it. I had filed it nowhere. Now I went back, opened it, and looked at the date stamp. April 9th. We had sent save the dates in January. I took a screenshot. I uploaded it to my secure client file system under a folder I labeled, with the particular flatness that comes from professional habit, personal/wedding. Then I went and told David. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My dad will walk you down the aisle." He said it simply, the way he says things that are true and decided. Not a question. Not a consolation. A statement of fact. I went to bed that night and I did not cry. I lay on my side and I thought about the April booking date, and what it meant that someone could hold that information in their hands and still call it a conflict. Gerald walked me down the aisle on September 14th. He wore a gray suit and a pocket square that matched my bouquet, which Margaret had quietly arranged with the florist 2 weeks earlier without telling me. When I took his arm at the back of the venue, he said, "You look like someone who already knows how this ends." He squeezed my hand. We walked. It was a beautiful ceremony. I will not describe it further here, not because it doesn't deserve description, but because it belongs to David and to me, and the people in that room who came. 84 guests. Neither of my parents was among them. I have the guest book. It sat on a table near the entrance, and people wrote in it with a gold pen. And it is now in the drawer of my nightstand where I keep the things that matter. Gerald wrote 2 sentences on the first page, because the woman running the guest book handed it to him first. I'll come back to what he wrote. My parents landed back in the United States on September 21st. My mother texted a photo of a gift they'd brought from Dubai. A small decorative box with a geometric pattern, wrapped in tissue paper. She said, "Can't wait to give you this in person. So sorry we missed it, it was complicated." I did not respond that day. What I did instead, I called the office of Howard Ellison, the estate attorney who had handled my maternal grandparents' estate, and who I knew, professionally, was still active. I had worked adjacent to his firm years ago on a probate case. I called him and I said I had a question about a family estate matter, and would he give me 20 minutes? He remembered me. He said yes. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Howard in a conference room that smelled like old wood and filtered air, and he slid a document across the table that changed the architecture of everything I thought I knew. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Vivian, had died 3 years earlier. She left behind a trust. I knew this in the general way you know things that don't seem to concern you. There was a trust, it had been distributed, it was handled. My mother had told me at the time that Grandma Vivian had taken care of everything. What Howard showed me was the original trust document. I turned to the schedule of assets. I read the distribution language. Then I read it again. Vivian's trust had included a specific bequest, a directed transfer of $47,000 to be held in a designated subtrust for the purpose of contributing to my wedding expenses, contingent on my marriage, payable to me upon proof of ceremony. $47,000. I looked up at Howard. He said, "Your grandmother was very specific. She told me that she'd watched your parents underfund your education, and she didn't want the same thing to happen to your wedding. She came to me personally." I looked back at the document. I turned to the distribution record. The subtrust had been funded. And then, I turned to the next page. There was a signed distribution authorization, dated 14 months ago, releasing the full amount to my mother as authorized agent for beneficiary. My mother had signed as my agent. She had collected $47,000 that my grandmother designated for my wedding. I asked Howard one question. "Did my mother ever tell me about this trust?" He said, "That's not something I'd know." But his expression was the expression of a man who already knew the answer. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with the copies Howard had made for me, and I read through them slowly, the way I read every document that contains a consequence. There was a second item. A letter, paper clipped to the back of the distribution records. In Vivian's handwriting, I recognized it from birthday cards I'd kept since childhood, addressed to me. It read in full. Sweetheart, if you're reading this with Howard, then either I'm gone and things got complicated, or you got smart and asked the right questions. Either way, the money was always yours. I knew your parents would find a reason to need it. I'm sorry I couldn't protect it better. The wedding I wanted you to have was always the point. Not the party you were always the point. Gran. I put the letter down on the table. I picked it up and read it again. I put it in the folder with the screenshots and the booking confirmation from April 9th and the guest book photograph and every other document I had been, without fully planning to assembling. That evening, David came home and I told him everything. He listened to all of it. Then he went very still in the way he goes still when he is about to become professionally useful, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to know exactly what happened to the money." He said, "Then let's find out. If you have ever watched someone spend money they weren't supposed to have, and then show up at your door with a decorative box from Dubai as a substitute, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. The paperwork is about to get interesting." Howard's records showed the transfer. David's contacts produced a forensic accountant named Sandra, who spent 2 weeks tracing the $47,000 through my mother's accounts. This is not a step I took lightly. It is a step I took precisely. The money had entered my mother's checking account. Within 10 days, $22,000 had been transferred to a travel account. The Dubai trip, flights, hotel, incidentals for herself, my father, and a partial contribution toward Marcus's share, had cost my parents approximately $19,400. The remaining $25,000 was distributed in smaller amounts over the following year. Some to Marcus, some to household expenses, some to a remodel of their kitchen that my mother had mentioned in passing, and that I had responded to with the words, "That sounds nice." I sat with this information for 8 days. During those 8 days, my mother called twice, my father called once, and Marcus sent a text asking if David's firm did any entertainment law because he had a project. I did not respond to any of them. On the 9th day, my mother showed up at my door. She came in the afternoon, unannounced, carrying the Dubai gift box and a pan of the casserole she makes when she wants to signal that something is being forgiven. I opened the door. I looked at the casserole. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and she began what I recognized as the prepared version of events. She was sorry. The trip had been planned before she realized the overlap. The flights were non-refundable. Marcus had needed them there. She had felt terrible the whole time, she said. She had cried on the plane. I listened to all of it. I did not take notes. I had already taken notes. When she finished, I asked her one question. I said, "Mom, did Grandma Vivian leave me anything in her estate?" She looked at the table. She was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. I counted, the way I count things that matter. She said, "She left a little something for everyone. You know how Gran was. It was all handled through Howard." I said, "Okay." I stood up. She looked up at me, confused, because she had expected more. That was the tell. She had come here to perform contrition and receive absolution, and she had not planned for the conversation to simply stop. I said, "I'll be in touch." I walked her to the door. I held it open. She left with the casserole still on the counter. That evening, I called David's attorney contact and said, "Send the letters. We did not pursue criminal charges. I want to be precise about that. What my mother had done was legally actionable. She had used a power of attorney in a way that was not consistent with its terms, but the cost, in time and relationship and exposure, of a court proceeding was not what I was after. What I was after was simpler. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted what my grandmother intended. The letters Howard sent on my behalf requested repayment of $47,000, with documentation of how the funds had been used, Within 30 days. They were addressed to my mother. They named the subtrust. They named the distribution date. They included, as an exhibit, the letter in Vivian's handwriting. 3 days after the letters were received, my mother called my aunt, her sister Diane, and Diane called me. Diane said, "Your mother is very upset. She says you're being vindictive." I said, "I know what the document says, Aunt Diane. I know what Gran wrote." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She told me Gran hadn't left you anything specific. She said it was general." I said, "I have the schedule of assets." Another pause. Then Diane said quietly, "Oh honey." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "Nothing right now. But thank you." Diane, I should tell you, is not a person without her own complications. She is not the hero of this story. But she had a conscience moment in that phone call, and I acknowledged it, and I moved forward. The family gathering happened 2 weeks later. My parents organized it. They called it a family dinner, but invited 6 people whose primary function was to be witnesses to whatever they had planned to say to me. Marcus was there. 2 of my father's brothers. My mother's cousin who had always served as unofficial family mediator. I was invited at the last moment. A text that read, "We're having dinner Sunday. We'd love for you to come. We can all talk." I went. I brought a folder. The dinner was at my parents' house. The table was set formally, which is how my mother signals that something is being decided. There were 7 people including me. David had offered to come. I told him no. I needed to be alone in that room with what I knew. My father opened with what he called context. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes about how much they loved me, how difficult the Dubai situation had been for all of them, how they had felt torn. My mother nodded at everything he said. Marcus was on his phone until my father looked at him, at which point he put it face down and looked attentive. My father's brother Carl said, at the end of my father's speech, that family works things out, and money should never come between people who love each other. I noted the word money. I had not yet said anything about money. My mother spoke next. She said she was sorry that the timing had been painful. She said she had taken her role as guardian of Gran's estate very seriously, and had tried to honor Gran's wishes in the best way she knew how, including making sure that Marcus, who had been struggling, received some support during a difficult time. She said, "Gran always wanted to help the whole family." I wrote that sentence down, exactly as she said it. Then she looked at me and said, "We really hope we can put this behind us and move forward as a family." The table looked at me. This was the moment they had been building toward. The surrender speech was supposed to happen here. I was supposed to say it was fine, or that I was hurt but willing to move forward, or some soft version of submission that would allow everyone to eat their pasta and go home feeling resolved. I said, "Can I say something?" My mother said, "Of course, sweetheart." I opened the folder. I said, "I want to start with the trust document. This is the original distribution schedule from Vivian's estate, prepared by Howard Ellison. I've marked the relevant section." I passed copies. I had made 7 around the table. My father looked at his copy. The color in his face changed. I said, "The subtrust shows a directed bequest of $47,000 to me for wedding expenses, contingent on marriage, payable upon proof of ceremony. The distribution authorization shows that Mom signed as my authorized agent and received the funds 14 months ago. My wedding was September 14th. I was never told this trust existed." The table was quiet. My mother said, That isn't the full picture. The money was managed as part of the whole." I said, "Mom, the document says what the document says." I laid the second page on the table. The bank transfer records. Sandra's summary in clean columns, dates, amounts, destinations. I said, "Dubai. Kitchen remodel. Marcus." I said each word the way I say things I've confirmed 3 times. Flat. Final. Marcus said, "Whoa, hang on." I said, "I'm not done." He stopped. I said, "I have one more thing." I reached into the folder, and I took out the last item. A photocopy. The original was in my nightstand, next to the guest book, of Gran's letter. The one in her handwriting. I read one line. The money was always yours. I knew your parents would find a reason to need it. I put the letter on the table. My mother's cousin said quietly, "Oh my God." My father said nothing. He was looking at the letter as if it had said something unkind about him, which it had, in the way that true things are sometimes unkind. My mother began to cry. I recognized this as a technique as much as a response. I had seen it in client meetings. I had learned to wait it out without filling the space. Carl said loudly, "This is family money, this is what Gran would have." I said, without looking at him, "Carl, I need you to read the document." He read the document. He stopped talking. Marcus said, and this is the sentence I have replayed, not for the wound of it but for the clarity. "You're seriously going to blow up the whole family over $47,000? I looked at him for the first time since I'd sat down. I said, "I'm not blowing anything up. I'm reading you a document that your grandmother signed in her right mind with an attorney present. I'm asking for what she left me. That is the whole of what I'm doing." My father looked up then. His eyes were red. He said, and I believe he meant it, "I didn't know about the letter. I didn't know she wrote that." I said, "I know." I said, "I believe you." I meant both of those sentences. I stood up, closed my folder, and picked up my bag. At the door, I turned around. I said, "Mom, you said Gran always wanted to help the whole family. You're right. She did." I looked at her. She tried to help me. I left. My parents repaid the $47,000 over 6 months. It required refinancing. The kitchen remodel had not been cheap, and it was not comfortable for them. I know this because Diane told me, and because I have read enough repayment structures to understand what the numbers implied. I did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. My grandmother had been dead for 3 years. The wedding that the money was meant for had already happened. Gerald had already walked me down the aisle, and no repayment schedule changes what that morning looked like. Marcus did not speak to me for 4 months. When he did, it was to ask again about the entertainment law question. I gave him David's paralegal's number, and let her handle it. He has not asked for anything since, which is either growth or strategy. I give it time. Carl maintains that I handled it wrong, but he says this to Diane, not to me, and Diane tells me with the tone of someone reporting a weather pattern. Acknowledging it without believing anyone can change it. My mother and I have a relationship now that I would describe as cordial and appropriately bounded. She calls on birthdays. I answer. She has not apologized for the money. The repayment was the apology, in the language my family speaks, which is financial and transactional and at least, in this case, accurate. My father wrote me a card when the final payment cleared. He said he was sorry he hadn't asked more questions when the estate was settled. He said Gran deserved better. He signed it with his first name, not Dad, which is the closest he has come in my lifetime to acknowledging that a title has to be earned. I put the card in the folder. The folder lives in a filing cabinet in my home office, behind the client files, under a tab that says personal/closed. The guest book is in my nightstand. Gerald's handwriting on the first page, in 2 sentences. This is the woman David chose. Remember that she was not given away today, she arrived. I read that sometimes. Not when I'm sad. When I need to remember what showing up looks like, and what it produces, and why it is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. The $47,000, the full amount once received, was used exactly as my grandmother intended. Half went toward a down payment on the house David and I bought in the spring. The other half I gave, in Gran's name, to a scholarship fund at the community college where I took my first paralegal course at 19. The fund is for working adult students in legal studies. It is small. It is named at my request after her. Vivian was precise about what mattered. She left it in writing. I learned from the best. Calm is not the same thing as passive. My family had confused the two my entire life. They saw me absorb, and they called it acceptance. They saw me not argue, and they called it agreement. They saw me not ask, and they called it contentment. Documents don't make those mistakes. Documents say what they say. And when you work in the language of documents long enough, you stop being surprised when the truth was always there, filed, signed, notarized, waiting for someone to finally read it. My grandmother read me. She wrote it down. And when it was time, I picked it up and carried it to the table. That is not revenge. That is honoring what someone left you. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and I think you already know what it is. If this story reminded you that the people who show up quietly, who set the table and sign the documents and write the letters no one reads until it's almost too late, those people are often the ones who loved you most clearly. And if it reminded you that calm is not the same thing as permission, take that with you. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. We keep the receipts here. It's what Gran would have wanted.